Welcome to Teal Talk, a podcast brought to you by the Ohio Alliance to End Sexual Violence. That's OAESV for short. We're your hosts, Taylor
and Laurie.
In each episode, we speak with professionals in the field to dive deep into the intersectional issues that affect survivors in Ohio.
Before we begin, we want to give a content warning that we will be discussing sexual violence and other issues that may be upsetting and triggering. If you need help, please feel free to call our resource line at 888-886-8388 during regular business hours, or the Ohio Sexual Violence Helpline 24/7 at 844-644-6435. Please take care of yourself.
Artificial intelligence is no longer a future conversation. It's here in our phones, our workplaces, our schools, and increasingly in the lives of survivors. For advocates, that raises big questions. How do we protect confidentiality in a world of AI note-takers and chatbots? Where is the line between efficiency and safety? Can AI ever be trauma-informed? And what happens when a technology that makes everything easier also makes harm easier? Today, I'm joined by Chad Sniffin. Chad has worked at the intersection of technology and abuse for years. In this conversation, we explore how AI is already shaping survivor experiences, what advocates need to be thinking about right now, and how to hold both hope and caution as technology evolves. This episode is thoughtful, challenging, and maybe even a little existential, but it's a conversation we need to be having. Thanks for joining us, Chad. Could you start by sharing a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Hello, I'm Chad Sniffin. I'm the Director of Digital Experience and Safety for Me Too International. I've been with Me Too for about 4 or 5 months now. Prior to Me Too, I worked with the National Network to End Domestic Violence on the Safety Net team, where you and I first met. Safety Net is focused on the intersection of technology and abuse. For Safety Net, I did a lot of different trainings related to technology and abuse and how advocates can work with survivors who are experiencing technology-facilitated abuse. And I talked a lot about AI when I worked for NNADV and how that is changing both advocacy and the experience of survivors. Prior to NNADV, I worked for the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, which is a project of Respect Together out of Pennsylvania. And I've also worked for Valor, which used to be called the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And I've also worked for local rape crisis programs in Tucson and in Sonoma County, California. And I worked for the University of California, Davis, and for the University of Arizona in their gender-based violence prevention programs.
A little bit of everything, everywhere.
I can't figure out anything else to do. That's the problem. I just keep keeping on in these same jobs.
I love it. You know, when I first listened to your workshop on AI, something you mentioned is how AI isn't really new. It's been around, and
right.
You know, in this present moment, it kind of feels like it's everywhere. It's impacting survivors, it's impacting advocates, it's impacting the work that we do. But before we dive into that, I kind of want to make sure we're grounded in the basics. When we say artificial intelligence, what are we really talking about? And what kind of tools are already shaping survivors' lives?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's kind of the technical idea of artificial intelligence, which is machine learning. And that has been with us for a long time. So recommendation systems, when YouTube recommends that you watch the next video, or Spotify or Netflix recommends that you watch a video based on your past viewing or watching habits, that is a form of machine learning, right? So that's a very structured type of machine learning, but that is a really basic type of artificial intelligence. Kind of falls under the umbrella of artificial intelligence. One of the first useful artificial intelligence tools was developed in the 70s to diagnose different types of viral infections, and it was very successful. It performed better than a lot of virologists. And so people have been working on and developing AI over many decades. There have been different AI booms and busts periods in that time. The real difference with the AI that we're interacting with now is really large language models. At a fundamental level, AI is a really statistically good guess at what you want to know or what you want to hear. And that is not made by a person, even though AI can really seem like a person. That is simply a result of gathering a massive amount of data and having an ability to link all of that data together in a way that makes sense to a machine. Technology has substantially evolved, but really it's our ability to interact with the technology that is substantially different. So when ChatGPT launched, that was the first time that people were really able to ask the questions in a human pattern of speech, in a human question, and have that human pattern of speech correctly interpreted, well, correctly or somewhat incorrectly, depending on how you think of it, interpreted by a machine and give an answer that we were looking for, right? So it's our ability to talk with natural speech to machines and get responses to them that aren't just triggered by certain keywords, but that are actually in context. Machines, the way we think of them right now, don't actually understand things. They respond to things in a statistically accurate way, right? So the ability of machines to make really, really good guesses about what we want to hear now is the real massive difference with artificial intelligence. And it is being merged into everything because people really want to sell it to us. Because these companies really want us to buy products that they have spent billions of dollars developing, and they need to recoup their money. And so that was all speculative investment that these companies have made. And that's billions and billions and billions of dollars of speculative investment that they need to make a return on. And so AI is being infused into every part of our life, whether we like it or not necessarily because there's a consumer demand for it, but because there is an investor need to recoup their investment. Things are different. I use AI quite a lot. So I have a paid ChatGPT subscription. I ask it questions, and usually it gives me a helpful answer. I ask it to help me rewrite documents. I ask it to help me draft things, and that is a capability that I didn't have before ChatGPT, right? Or before Gemini or Copilot or whatever else, whatever AI program that you use. Pretty much everyone on our staff uses some sort of AI note taker. I personally am really bad at taking notes. I've never liked taking notes very much. I like to listen to the conversation. I'm really bad at writing things down about the conversation. AI note takers are really great for me.
One point that you said that I want to repeat is just that like technology and AI have always evolved, but this moment feels different because of how accessible it is.
Yeah.
You know, you don't need to know coding or like this very technical speak. And when you're using something like ChatGPT, like the way that it's responding, it does feel very human-like, and it's almost like eerie.
Yes, it is. And that is, I mean, one of the interesting things for me about it is how much unmet human need we're seeing through that. Mm-hmm. Unmet need for companionship and unmet need for communication. I'm sure both you and I and whoever is listening to this podcast have heard of people who have entered into very human-feeling relationships with chatbots, even if those chatbots were not designed for relationships. And it really speaks to the ability of large language models to interact with us in a way that's really meaningful to us, right? That's really the big difference. And that's a big opportunity. It's a big risk. If you're in a place where you can't differentiate between a human interaction and an interaction with an AI, if you have a really deep level of need and the only way you can get that need met is through artificial intelligence, that is a very understandable problem for you. And it's very understandable that you might use artificial intelligence to meet that need, but it's important to know that the ability of artificial intelligence is really limited because it's not a real person. And it's not, even though it feels very authentic to you, right? There can be just a lot of dysfunction and a lot of harm when you do come up against the artificial limit of the thing that's helping you meet your need, right? There's something called a context window in large language models, which is basically how much information a model will remember about you when it answers your question. And the size of context windows can vary, but they are finite, right? Because it's not efficient for ChatGPT to remember everything you've ever told it when it answers one of your questions. And I'm mentioning ChatGPT specifically because I have the most experience with ChatGPT, but all of the large language models work like this. When your context window overflows, ChatGPT will forget things about you. They will forget things that you told it when you first met it and started to tell it things about you. And so people have experienced and reported experiencing like an almost sense of death because ChatGPT no longer remembers their birthday, or no longer remembers their first dog's name, or when something happened to them, traumatic happened to them when they were a child, because that information has overflowed out of its context window. So that's a hard limitation of chatbots that ironically is one of the things that the companies are really working on to extend the size of context windows so that they can give more meaningful answers to people for a longer amount of time. And I think we'll see this over time. It will become less and less easy to see like the hard artificial limit of communicating with a machine versus a person, right? A chatbot will chat with you for as long as you want. So there are teams that spend hours and hours and hours a day chatting with chatbots because that's how much they want to chat, and no human being is going to give that to them, right? They have a need, they're getting it met, and they may or may not be understanding, or even at some developmental level, they may be missing the idea that, because it's important to know when people don't want to talk to you, right? Like it's a social cue. It helps you to develop relationships with real people, right? Because real people aren't machines that can listen to every question and listen to every comment for that you have and every idea that you have for 10, 12 hours a day, right? I mean, if you have a real person who's willing to do that, you may have a codependent relationship. And that's an important thing to learn, like, at an early age, that you tend to have codependent relationships. It's a healthy relationship skill to learn like what your relationship style is. You're not going to learn that from a machine, right? Because the machine will do that. And so I'm really straying into beyond any questions that you actually asked me.
No, I love it. And this is all tying into survivors. Like, I feel survivors could very possibly have a lot of unmet needs, especially if they're in the peak of their, healing journey, or they haven't connected with an advocate yet, and they find comfort in using this chatbot as a therapist almost. Something you mentioned that you like to use AI for is like note taking, or drafting a document for you or something. So I'm wondering if an advocate or like a nonprofit organization did want to dabble in using AI for situations like that, how should they start thinking about confidentiality?
That's a really important question. And it's something that the safety net team specifically addresses a lot. It is important to distinguish between information that is yours or your agency's and information that belongs to a survivor, right? Not just because of federal law, although there are federal laws that have requirements of any nonprofit that works with survivors and receives federal money, but also just from a moral perspective and an ethical perspective. It's important to remember that when you share information with artificial intelligence, with any artificial intelligence system, that you are also sharing that information, or have the risk of sharing that information with the people, the actual human beings who run those systems. So you can find privacy policies that relate to survivor or to any information that you share. AI note takers, for example, will tell you in their privacy policies that they don't use your information for training data. That's important because what training data means, when you train in artificial intelligence, you have to let it know when it has succeeded at a task and when it has failed as a task. It's just like kind of training a child or a dog, really. Like, you have to give it positive and negative reinforcement, and a person has to define what is a success and what is a failure for that AI. There are actually ways in which you can have one AI train another AI, but even that trainer AI needs to be trained by a person. What that means is that there is a risk when you share survivors' data in a system and you don't have any confidentiality in the system where that system could be used for training, or your data could be used for training, that a human being may read or have access to that information. Because the human being needs to know when the model has given a correct response, or a response that makes sense versus a response that does not make sense. So that is the training data vulnerability of using AI systems. There's also a legal vulnerability of using AI systems. So ChatGPT, for example, has a privacy policy in place, but ChatGPT has also been sued by a number of people. There is a judge's order that requires ChatGPT to save all of the questions that people have asked of ChatGPT. So even though those questions are supposed to be private or are not supposed to be saved, a judge has overruled that policy of ChatGPT And those are being saved, even though there's a separate privacy policy in ChatGPT that says those are not. And so that is an example of even in a situation where you have been told that something is private, there can be situations where that private thing may not be private. This is an especially difficult problem for nonprofit victim service agencies to deal with because it is so inefficient for us not to use online services, right? Sure, we could choose not to use Google Workspaces, or we can choose not to use Microsoft Office or any other kind of online record system like whatever online database you use. Is even if they don't have AI in them, you're still storing survivors' data in someone else's computer, right? And you have a service level contract with them or some sort of service level agreement with them. But a judge can still come in and get that data. Like a judge's order can still come in and get that data. There's even concern that some companies might respond with survivor data or other user data for administrative warrants from places like, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, right, which do not have a judge signing them, right? And so there's all sorts of data that could go into an online system that you might expose, right? If you make the principled choice of not using any online systems, then you have a massive inefficiency in your workforce. It's difficult to find a balance point because survivor serving agencies have like a both legal and moral obligation to protect survivor information, but they need to find the right balance between protecting that information and being able to provide efficient service so that they can help as many survivors as possible. So sometimes what victim serving agencies will take away from talks like these is that, well, I shouldn't use anything. Like I shouldn't use AI or I shouldn't use anything online and that's all evil. I'm not saying that it's not all evil, but I'm saying that people use it because it makes their day go faster, right? These things are efficient tools. The best way to serve the most survivors possible is to be as efficient as possible, right? So it's really important to understand privacy policies. It's really important to see what privacy policies apply to whatever service you're using. If you're feeding any kind of survivor data into a system, it is important to know if there's a potential for that data to be used for training data or any other vulnerability or any other legal exposure in the future, like a judge's warrant, right? Does that mean that you shouldn't use these things? It means that there's more risk to using these things, right? There's more risk for survivors and more risks for you as an agency for using these things. It is also true that survivors will use these things themselves all the time. Survivors, I have no stats on this at all, but I'm sure survivors ask ChatGPT questions all the time, questions that directly relate to their experience as survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, child abuse, trafficking, anything, right? And I'm sure that if ChatGPT were ever to kind of gather up all those questions, it's probably on par with the amount of actual service that advocates deliver, right? If they were actually, because the scale of use is just, we can't match the scale of corporations, right? Like just in terms of what kind of impact popular services or popular products have on people's lives. Like we just don't get anywhere near enough money from any source, from donors or the federal government, to interact with people on the scale of, for example, Uber. Like Uber gives billions of rides a year. Like there's no agency or collection of agencies that does billions of anything a year. And I mean, that's kind of an apples and oranges comparison, but it's important to understand that efficiency is good. And the scale of things is important, right? Because if we really want to have an impact on society, we have to try to work at scale as much as possible. And so it's really to our benefit to engage with systems and try to scale up our services as much as possible. So if you're a crisis center or coalition or domestic violence agency and you're thinking about AI, it's much better for you to tell people how they can use AI than just to tell people they shouldn't. I mean, it's a very different thing to limit your use case than to just say no one uses AI ever and have people doing it on their private accounts or people doing it on their phones or people doing it at home or, are basically where you can't see them, right? It's much better to guide their use than it is to just outlaw their use. And because they're people, and especially younger people, if you have like people in their early 20s, they use ChatGPT to help them graduate high school, like help them graduate college, and they're going to want to use it at work, right? It's much better to guide that use than it is to kind of not take advantage of the ways in which it can increase your efficiency.
It's promising speed, it's promising automation. And as you mentioned, nonprofits are under-resourced. So it makes sense to want to cave into this pressure to be more efficient. But as you described, there is a line between efficiency and safety. And I feel like this whole conversation is just about like, how do we navigate that?
Right. And And it's very difficult to navigate. There are a lot of people who oppose AI in principle, and I totally get that. AI is going to be horrible for our environment, like AI, for our environment that is already challenged to deal with so many things. AI is a massive consumer of electricity. It's a massive, which then ties into fossil fuel consumption. Server farms are a massive generator of heat, which is also true of crypto, actually. Like both AI and crypto are competing to be who can use the most electricity and generate the most heat that then gets dumped into our environment. And so there's a massive environmental impact of AI and all sorts of things. And it's totally understandable for anyone who has a principled objection to AI in general, right? But it is also true that things are more efficient with these tools, right? And you can do more at scale with these tools. Survivor data is not something you own, right? Survivor data is something that survivors own and they're letting you use. And so it's important to first ask for consent and ask survivors if it's okay for you to use their data in various ways. And I want to call it AI note takers specifically for this. If something is free to you, as many AI note takers are, that means they're making money off of your data, right? So a lot of AI note takers services present themselves as free, and you can usually find in any kind of free plan that the reason they're letting you use it for free is because they're going to use your data to make the product better. Databases of how users have used products is inherently valuable and something that can be sold, actually. One of the most valuable assets of Waymo or any other kind of self-driving car company is not actually the cars. It's actually the data that they're getting from the cars, which they can sell. And that's true of note-taking companies as well. So along with kind of being responsible with the data that survivors are letting you use, being cognizant of the idea that anything for free is not free. It's just that the cost is being passed on in a way that you don't see it, right? So, which then means that if you want to use any kind of AI product with that and have survivor data interact with the AI product, that you need to make sure that it's not free, or if it's not free, that it is responsible. So there are already several AI trauma-informed chatbots that can respond to survivor questions using kind of a curated database and set of responses, and that have been kind of trained to be trauma-informed in a meaningful way, right? And they do allow for free questions. The ones that I'm thinking of, Amy Says and Ruth. Actually, I'm not even sure it's Amy Says. It might be Ask Amy. I always get that mixed up. But anyway, but I think it's yeah. Fact check me later. It's one of those two. You can put the link in the notes. But it's one of those two. And I just happen to know the people who founded those, and their use case for founding those two AI chatbots is that rape crisis centers and domestic violence agencies are overworked. There's a lot more questions and a lot more need out there than any agency or any set of advocates can provide, right? And so there's waiting lines or missed calls and things like that. And also, we're really training our children to use chatbots like really solidly, right? Homework use is a total gateway drug to using chatbots for everything. And we're really going to see this in upcoming generations where chatbots are going to be the first go-to for an increasing number of people, right, as children become adults. If we're going to have responsible systems for responding accurately and responsibly to survivors, but also dealing with survivor data in a respectful way and safe way, we really start needing developing these systems now because it's just going to scale up in the future. So another reason why I also want to call out kind of these specific survivor-facing AI chatbots is that they were designed intentionally to deal with survivor data and survivor information, and most things that people are asking questions of are not, like the Gemini and ChatGPT. I mean, that's not to say they're not being responsible in their own way, but that they weren't designed for that, right? And that's an important distinction to make. So to kind of get around to whatever the question was that started this particular thread, which I don't even remember anymore, there are ways in which we can use AI meaningfully to support survivors, and we should do that because survivors will want to use them anyway. But we need to put a lot of thought and intentionality behind how those tools are made. We can't control how Gemini or ChatGPT is made, but we can give input where we can, and we can advocate as advocates, for safer policies and safer laws ultimately, which will need some laws to do some things eventually to kind of, to manage these giant repositories of data.
It was actually funny. I was going to ask you if ChatGPT or AI could ever be trauma informed, which I feel like is a question I never thought I would ask in my entire life.
Yeah, right.
AI systems reflect the data that they're trained on, whether AI is training AI or a person is training AI, et cetera, et cetera. And in this field, we don't really have much data on sexual violence or like who sexual violence is impacting. So, I mean, I don't even know if you have an answer to this, or I don't really know what kind of question I'm asking, but this conversation has really brought to mind for me this idea of, could AI be limiting in this sort of way, or like not accurately reflecting the reality?
Yeah. Well, it's a great point that AI is only as good as the data you give it. So where we have seen bias, gender-based bias, racial bias in AI, it's easy to point to AI and say, how can you create this biased machine? But it's harder to recognize that all of the media that we have fed it is in itself inherently biased. So especially in the early days of image generation in AI, it was very easy to run queries of asking of like, show me a man in prison, and you know, 7 times out of 10 it would show you a person of color in prison. Show me a nurse in a hospital, and 10 times out of 10 actually would show you a woman. Show me a doctor in a hospital, 9 out of 10 times a white man in a hospital, right? So it's easy to say, well, AI is biased, but it's hard to recognize that all the pictures of doctors in hospitals are of white men. All the pictures of nurses in hospitals are of white women. Most of the pictures of people in prison are people of color in prison. So the AI itself is just reflecting the bias of the data that is being given, right? And so when that gets into gender-based violence, it would kind of be remiss if I didn't talk about the way AI is directly impacting, people right now, which is mostly in image abuse, right? And there's been lots of recent media news stories about image abuse in AI, in that AI can alter a picture in any way that you want it to, generally, because it's all just data for the AI. It has no sentiment about what picture it's generating. And so it is very easy to nudify people. This has been recently a big problem among teenagers and their ability to easily download apps that will nudify pictures of their peers, and then they can share those pictures. And it's a problem that there's already been a lot of legislative action in different states around having basically the generation of synthetic images fall under existing image abuse laws, which has been a positive movement. But it is also just very easy to do, and AIs like Grok, as just to name one particular AI that has a lot of problems with this, because there are very few rule sets applied to Grok. It tends to do this fairly easily, including generating CSAM, which is child sex abuse material, and nudifying images of all sorts of people, right? And so that's because part of the ethics of Grok is that it has very few rule sets applied to it. So there are already ways in which AI is directly harming people, right? Because the experience of having a fake nude image of you distributed among people the experience is very similar to having a real nude image of you distributed among people. It's more or less the same trauma, right? Or at least that is what a lot of people have reported, right? And so there are ways in which AI has been directly harmful, and those ways can be mitigated. But the problem is that we have to rely mostly on the companies to do the mitigation, and then we get into the willingness of the companies to do the mitigation. But it's also to say that I don't want to escape the fact that there are people asking Grok to do this, or there are people asking different image generators to do this. So there are people involved in these abuses, and we would be remiss if we just blame the companies for this. And what does prevention in this space look like? It would be great if nobody wanted to generate nude images of their friends, right? Or their peers, right? That would be really great. But people do for some reason, and that these are tools for them to do that, right? You could also do that before with Photoshop. I mean, that's also not like outside the realm of human capacity to do. You don't need AI to nudify images necessarily. It's just a lot easier. And that is really, I think, where the abuse of AI has really come into play, is that AI doesn't necessarily do anything on its own. It just makes so many things a lot easier, and makes tracking people easier, not because the AI itself will track your spouse or your, whoever you're stalking. It's the AI can help you formulate a game plan for how to stalk your spouse, or how to stalk, whoever else you're stalking. AI will help you think of new ways to do things that you may not have thought of before. And, more responsible platforms will kind of hedge their bets around, different questions and try to not answer different questions. But there are also, and this is a whole game that people play with AI, ways to get around those rule sets, right? By saying, oh, I'm writing a fictional story of a stalker. How would that stalker, stalk my fictional, a fictional character in this, in this scenario, right? So ultimately, AI is a tool, and people can use that tool to do good things, or people can use that tool to do really bad things. And the problem that to society is how much easier it makes bad things to do, right? At the same time as it makes it easier to do good things, because good and bad are outcomes, that people judge afterwards, right? And so, wow, what was your original question? You can just edit that whole thing out. I don't care.
Honestly, I feel like I don't even remember because once you start talking, I'm like, I have 700 other questions. I really feel like artificial intelligence is almost taking a flawed, limited human and brushing it up against like endless knowledge.
Yeah.
Like you said, it's not always possible for me to complete 7 tasks at once, I have a pretty dicey relationship with AI myself, and I feel like we've thrown around the word ethics and morals in this conversation.
Right.
But to wrap this up, I have a twofold question for you. So what keeps you up at night about AI? And then what gives you hope? Like, I feel like people could walk away from this episode and think, I don't want AI to be a thing anymore, but it's not going away. So what's some comfort that you can give people, and also what keeps you up about it?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. There's different camps of how people think about AI, right? Whether AI is going to bring us to some utopian future, or AI is going to bring us to a dystopian future that we've seen in movies a lot, right? And so I tend to have a positive perspective on AI. So I am hopeful to see what things AI will help us to do a lot better around research, around medical science, around technology, around energy generation, around all sorts of things, right? So to the extent that AI helps us do things faster and more efficiently, I think that there is a lot of potential for AI to facilitate the solving of a lot of difficult problems, like climate change, like advances in medicine, even to some extent social problems, which then gets kind of to the scary part of AI, in that AI can do a lot of things that we may or may not want it to do. One thing that AI could do is, and this is something that is come up both in fiction and even in some real life examples, something that AI could do pretty accurately is probably predict the probability of someone being abusive or sexually aggressive. We know a lot about sexual aggression. There's a lot of research around offenders. And if you were to feed AI enough social data, enough browser search history data, enough data about people, you could probably pretty accurately predict who is likely to be sexually aggressive in life or in a relationship and who is not, right? Is that something we want to do? Right. So this is kind of getting to the Minority Report like example. Minority Report, the story or the movie, relied on like people who could see the future, right? You don't need that to have Minority Report. You just need to have a big enough data set, right? Like, and so you don't need to literally see the future to do Minority Report. You just need enough data about people, and you can predict all sorts of things about them, right? But I think we will even more so in the future run into salient questions about should we do this thing or not. And I think predictors of crime, and with crime data being massively biased, especially crime data in the US, like, yeah, sure, I can predict if I were to use existing data sets around crime, all sorts of things that will almost universally point to people of color, especially Black people, being perpetrators of crime, because that's where the data set is, not because that's where the reality is, right? Because for all the things we know about incarceration and being a Black person in the United States, right? And historical marginalization and all sorts of inequalities, right? That's nothing about being Black in the United States, that's about the institution of the United States and Black people. So should we do that? Like, I bet you we can have the biggest prevention effect ever if we gave everyone, some sort of primer on consent if they met certain scores. We could probably do that in the military. We could easily do that in the military, actually. I just don't know if we should, because not only will people feel targeted, because they will be targeted, and feel like they're being blamed for something they didn't do because they didn't do it yet. They're just likely to do it, right? And we might do it also in a biased way, right? Because I bet you, depending on which data set you use, you're going to give that to more people of color than you are to white people, right? Whereas in terms of actual sexual aggression, there aren't actually a lot of differences. At the population level, there's no differences, right? So that's something that kind of, I think, wow, does that keep me up at night? When it happens, it will. Like, if we ever decide to get there, I think those kinds of questions people should think about. Ultimately, getting back the idea of trauma-informed AI, I have definitely met advocates who are not good at their job. Not because they were bad people, but because they didn't get enough training, because they weren't emotionally attuned to, being an advocate, because they had a lot of their own unresolved trauma, right? And when I have asked questions of trauma-informed AI, kind of, pretending to be a survivor and how survivor AI questions, the AI has been pretty consistently trained to be good at its job, right? Because it's easy to train a machine to be good at its job. It's harder to train people to be good at their job. There's a lot of things that go into making a good advocate. Now, I think a good advocate will always be better than a good AI. Right. I that's my humanistic view of it. Right. I solidly believe that a good advocate will be a better experience and more helpful than a good AI. But I think you can have consistently good AIs and not consistently good advocates. What that means for the rape crisis field and the movement in general is that it's on us to make better advocates. Like, if we want to compete with the AI, we should make sure that advocates have training, that they have resources, that they have all the things that they need to be really good at their jobs and better than an AI, and have the emotional resources, because being an advocate is very difficult. And there's secondary trauma is a thing. AI doesn't get secondary trauma.
Yeah.
Right. AI, can go all day. AI can do crisis all day, every day, and still give you the same response. An advocate cannot do that. Right. You and I have both met lots of burnt out advocates who didn't want to be burnt out and didn't want to acknowledge that they were burnt out, but they were. And that's just a human thing. That doesn't mean they're bad advocates, but that does mean that they are a finite resource, right? And that you need to nurture that resource. So if you want your advocates to be better than AI, you have to give them resources. You have to give them the space they need to deal with what their own trauma and any other secondary trauma they're picking up. But I do, in my humanistic heart, believe that a good advocate is still better than a good AI in any circumstance. But that you need to create a situation in which you can have advocates be their best. And if you don't have that situation, AI isn't actually a bad second option, but it is not the best option, I believe.
Well, I could talk to you all day, Chad, I think. I have 4 takeaways from our conversation, okay? 1, practice digital safety. 2, draft your AI policies now. 3, support your local nonprofit. And 4, watch the movie iRobot.
Right. Yeah. Yes. I would say iRobot's a good movie because it's a hopeful view of what an artificially intelligent robot would look like that had an internalized and kind of hard-coded sense of morality. And maybe we'll have people with a sense of morality in the future too.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Chad, for taking the time to chat all things AI with me.
All things AI. It's a whole new podcast series for you. All things AI.
Right? Awesome.
AI isn't going away, but what we do with it, how we regulate it, how we build it, how we use it in our work, that's still up to us. The takeaway isn't to reject technology outright, but to engage with it intentionally. Practice digital safety, draft your AI policies, support advocates so they can be better than the machines, and maybe watch iRobot. Thank you for listening to Teal Talk. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Teal Talk. We hope you enjoyed our deep dive into intersectional issues affecting survivors in Ohio. If you like what you heard, subscribe and leave us a 5-star rating and review, recommend us to a friend, and follow us on Instagram and Facebook at OAESV and Twitter at Ohio Alliance ESV. If you'd like to learn more about us and the services we offer, sign up for our email list, or read a transcript of this episode, visit oaesv.org.
Want to share a comment or ask a question for a future episode? Just click on the link in the show notes to leave us a voicemail. And remember, we're here to help. Feel free to call our resource line at 888-886-8388 during regular business hours, or the Ohio Sexual Violence Helpline 24/7 at 844-644-6435. See you next time.